Well, it's good to be in front of you all this morning. Hope that there's a lot of you online too that are watching. Guys, I'm really excited to be starting this new series. For the last few weeks, we've been going through our family values. If you were here, like I've been saying, if you were here a year ago when Josh was in his first year of being lead pastor, we were establishing who we are as ethnos and talking about our values as a church and kind of talking about what that means. And so we spent the last few weeks just going back over that and understanding what it means to be a diverse family that's rooted in prayer, growing in grace, leading generously, and reaching authentically. Sometimes I get mixed up with those last two. There's always like that little pause. I'm like, yeah, that one. Because I'm like, oh, don't want to mess that up. You know, just don't tell Josh that I messed up our last two values there. That's right. It's only on recording. But I'm really excited because we're starting a new series on Elijah. And the neat thing, and the reason why I'm so excited about it, is that we're going to be talking about a lot of different things that I, in particular, haven't gotten to preach on before. And so I'm going to be going through a few firsts of my own this morning, as we're going to be looking at a character from the Old Testament. I don't get to preach from the Old Testament a whole lot, but there's so much to be learned as we look at the lives of people like Elijah and prophets. And it's also something that we oftentimes as Christians, as followers of Jesus, you know, we're really kind of like familiar with the New Testament. Like the book of John is my favorite gospel, and I can probably ask each person in the room, like, what's your favorite gospel? What's your favorite book? And a lot of times it'll be a New Testament book. Maybe there will be some exceptions. But when we look at people like Elijah, there's a little bit of, at least in my experience, maybe some of you have experienced this too, there's a little bit of like a vague idea of who this person was. Like, I know that he's a prophet. I know that he's a big deal because he's mentioned in the New Testament. Jesus talks about him. People asked Jesus if he was Elijah. He saw Elijah on the mountain, like during the transfiguration. Sometimes I struggle with that word too. You know, you can graduate seminary and still struggle with some of the like long, weird words. But there's this really interesting history with these figures from the Old Testament that we want to spend some time with. And there's a lot to unpack as we're starting this new series. And so one of the things as I was getting ready for this first part is there's so much to unpack. Because one of the neat things about Elijah that we'll see is that there's not much of an introduction for Elijah. He kind of just pops into the scene. That's something that like I'd forgotten until I was going back and learning. And it's very strange because we're very familiar with the name Elijah, but we don't realize that this is a person who very little introduction, very little buildup. He's just there. Now, I don't have a really elaborate story to open with, but I do want to ask you if you ever struggle with a need for control in your life. Do you find it difficult to trust God in His plan and provision when things feel really uncertain? Do you sometimes feel like, although you know that God is real and that He cares about what's happening in your life, the truth of the fact feels maybe distant and unreal? Do you find yourself trusting in God's plan and provision in word, but in your heart you feel the need maybe to take matters into your own hands? What does it look like for us as followers of Jesus to live in the reality of a real living God? Today, as we're going to be spending some time in the book of 1 Kings, what I want to do is I want to kind of unpack a few things first. Right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about prophecy. I wrote a lot in my notes about things that we could unpack, but I was like, maybe not this time. We talked about maybe doing a series in Revelation one day. That could be an exciting thing. So I don't want to steal any thunder from Josh if that's an idea that is still kind of in the works. But because we don't get to talk about prophecy a whole lot, but we hear about it a lot in the rest of the church and sometimes in the news too. Just going to touch on that a little bit. We're going to be talking about just the background context of what and where Elijah was stepping into. So we're going to look at a short snippet of the history of the kingdom of Israel and kingdom of Judah. That's going to be an interesting little nugget of history there for you. And then we're also going to just look at who Elijah was. And then we're going to look at our main passage, which is going to be, as I mentioned, it's going to be in 1 Kings. It's going to be in chapter 17. And we're going to look at just 3 movements of the story. And we're going to look at them briefly because it's 24 verses. But honestly, there's 3 main parts that you can kind of look at and see these different moments. Because a lot of you may be familiar with stories like Elijah versus the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. We're going to get to that, but we're not going to get to it today. And so this is sort of a lead up to that moment. It's going to be really interesting as we begin to look at what that is. So as we get started, just want to touch a little bit on what prophecy is, just to kind of help us out and get the wheels greased as we're getting ready to talk about Elijah. Now, the question is, what is prophecy? There's a lot of different authors right now. There's a lot of different authors throughout the last several decades. People are really fascinated by prophecy. And it's interesting because we don't always maybe think that we're saying this, meaning the same thing that we're saying. When one person says prophecy, it might not be the same thing another person is saying. But this is, I read a really neat book for my Hebrew class. There's going to be some Hebrew that pops up through this sermon. I was like, I paid a lot of money for that Hebrew class that I took this summer. Some tears, too. I was like rocking a baby to sleep for the first time. So a little bit of Hebrew is going to come up. But I read a really great book that unpacked just the nature, really, of Old Testament prophecy. And what they broke down, prophecy particularly that we see in the Old Testament, is 3 aspects. We see prosecution, persuasion, and prediction. Now, what that means is when we look at the lives of Old Testament prophets, we kind of imagine it sometimes in pop culture at least, that involves like the prediction aspect, right? That means maybe even fortune telling, that we kind of imagine that I'm seeing something happening in your future, and this is what's going to come to fruition. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to see if this prophet's legit or not based on how this is going to come true. We think about that, but really, honestly, it's the third point because that's a pretty low aspect of what prophets actually did in the Old Testament. We do see predictions that are made, and when you read some of the major prophets like Isaiah, we see some of the messianic passages that pop back up in the New Testament, but the reality is that prediction was not a major part of what prophets did. In reality, prophets were the ones who were specifically appointed by God, Yahweh, to go to the nation of Israel and to let them know, you guys are messing up. I'm here to tell you exactly what's going wrong, what you're doing, and how you are not keeping to the covenant that you made with Yahweh. Back in the time of Abraham, the same God who later brought your ancestors, your fathers, out of Egypt, you're breaking covenant with Yahweh. You're supposed to be a nation that is representative to the whole world, and you're not doing that. That's the majority of what prophets were doing. Now, and secondly, they were also involved with persuasion, because with prosecution also comes the other side of that coin, which is the persuasion of you need to come back to Yahweh. There needs to be repentance. There needs to be a turning away from what it is that you've been doing, worshiping other gods, combining worship of other gods with the worship of Yahweh. You need to come back. It's time to remember the covenant that you made. It's time to look back at the Mosaic law, and it's time to remember the heart of what it is, that you are God's people, that this is your identity. Who you are now is not who you're supposed to be. And the third part is prediction. It's if you continue on this road, here's what's going to happen. And sometimes it's because you're continuing on this road, this is what's going to happen. This is what I, the Lord, am going to have to do. And we know that it was always part of God's redemptive plan to bring Jesus, the Messiah, from the beginning. And we see that sprinkled throughout because time and time again, because they're humans, and we like to point the finger like, man, those Israelites, they complained all the time. They kept worshiping other gods. They kept just like mixing with other nations. There's all these things that they're doing wrong. We like to look back and we like to say like, man, they really messed up. The truth is, we're just as fallen as they are. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I want to kind of touch on this aspect of prediction because this is something that we get hung up on a lot. And I want to give a few just kind of brief warnings because when we talk about prophecy, there's a lot that comes up in our imaginations, right? So the warnings that I would give when we're addressing prophecy as a topic is first, we sometimes tend to, you'll hear this sometimes from other messages. As I was preparing for this sermon, a lot of things I would hear is that we like to look at prophets from the Old Testament and we like to look at their lives and be like, see what this person did? This is what you as a Christian are supposed to do too. We got to be a little bit careful about that. And so my warning would be modeling lives of the prophets for our own lives. Now, that's not to say that we don't look at them and see elements of how they're being obedient and trusting in the faithfulness of God. But what's really happening is that these are specific people called by Yahweh to give specific messages in very particular times. One of the things that I kind of kept hearing was, this is, Elijah was a man of God. Here's how you can be a man or a woman of God too. And it's kind of like, yeah, that is there. But let's also remember what it is that Elijah is pointing to. What's the reality of Yahweh that Elijah is trying to say, no, look at this. Don't just look at me and like the aspects of my journey as I'm building my relationship with Yahweh. Look at who I'm trying to point you to. Because this is written for the nation of Israel, but as we're reading it, we're supposed to be, as we've been brought in, that we also look back and see, like, what is it that we as God's people, as those who have been adopted into the family, what is it that we can learn? What is it that the prophets were trying to say when they're saying, hey, this is wrong, you need to remember who you are? What is it that we need to be looking at that they're pointing to? Second is mistaking prophecy exclusively for future telling. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but that's one of the things that we kind of tend to pigeonhole prophecy into, is that we think it is just the future telling aspect, right? But like I said earlier, that's kind of like, in terms of the three main parts, it's on the lowest tier because it's not the biggest part of what the prophet's ministry was meant to do. Third is trying too hard to find fulfillment of signs and future events. Now, this is something you'll see bookshelves all over the place, right? There's the books and things that are written about blood moons, right? They're looking about when's Christ going to come back? What are the signs that we need to be looking for? There's so many. Honestly, they're kind of cool to read because you're looking at all these things like, oh my word, there's all of these different aspects and moments that are aligning, moments in history. But here's the reality that I want to remind us, is that we've been in the day of Christ for a long time. In fact, the same author that I was reading who named these three aspects said, hey, we need to be anticipating and need to be looking forward to Christ, just as the church has been doing for the last 2,000 years, because we don't know when the time is. And the problem when we try too hard to look for the fulfillments and we kind of get a little bit distracted by is something being fulfilled in one of the New Testament prophecies? Are we starting to witness history unfold? Is this the moment? The problem that I want to warn us about is that we can distract ourselves with specific events happening around the world and we lose sight of some of the needs that are maybe happening right in front of us. Or maybe some of the other ways that maybe Satan is at work in the church and in the rest of the world, right? Last week, Josh brought up just a tragedy that happened in Burma, right? Something that I didn't even know about. Because there's a lot of things happening in the news, and when we get too focused on, is this wars and rumors of wars that's happening, that's unfolding? It can be really easy to distract ourselves from what we as followers of Christ are being called to do. And one of the things that I've named in our prayer is that we talk about all the time is the Great Commission. And so sometimes we lose focus of the hurt that's happening in the world. When we start to get really laser focused, do I have the right theology? Am I reading the signs just right? Am I finding the fulfillment of this prophecy here and here and here? And we have to be careful of that. So, with that in mind, and particularly when we're talking about the life of Elijah, what we're going to be seeing is how he's going to be confronting what the nation of Israel is doing wrong in terms of their covenant relationship with Yahweh. So let's shift gears a little bit to background historical context. Now, this isn't super fancy, but this is hopefully for those of you who are, Josh is always calling out the engineering audience, so I'm going to give them a little bit of a shout out too. This is the most probably engineering-like thing that I've done, is we've got a nice little chronology chart of kind of the history of Israel, and this is just a part of it too. And what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into part of this here. It may still be a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to explain what's happening. So, as we step into our story with Elijah, what we're going to see is that this is a particular moment in time that's been leading up through the monarchy, right? So there was a time before King David and even King Saul that there was no king in Israel. They wanted a king. There was King Saul, and then we have King David. And Solomon right there is that big blue rectangle, and that's the son of David. Now, Solomon was the one who built the temple in Jerusalem, right? A big, beautiful temple. David wasn't able to build it, so his son did. Now, something significant happens at the very end of Solomon's reign, because if y'all remember the story of Solomon, those of you who may be familiar, if you're not, basically what happens is that Solomon begins to intermarry with a lot of women from different cultures, mostly for political reasons and alliances. The problem that happens is that as he's doing that, and as he's building these political alliances, having marriages, and all these different, the women that are coming into his courts from different tribes and cultures and nations, is that he's also beginning to syncretize. And that's a fancy word for combining their faith and their pagan worship, their worship of literal pagan deities, with the worship of Yahweh. And so we begin to see this sort of crumbling, this sort of decay that's happening right towards the end of Solomon's reign. And you see that nice big split that happens right after that blue rectangle. That is when there was a revolt by this guy. There's a top red bar there, and then a bottom green bar there. You see in the first one, if you can read it, if not, I'll read it to you. That's a man named Jeroboam. He led a revolt and basically split the kingdom of Israel in two. So I don't have a map, but what happens is we now have two kingdoms, a southern kingdom and a northern kingdom. We have Israel in the north, much bigger in terms of real estate, and we have Judah in the south. And then we have basically two different monarchies of both nations. And what's interesting is, when this happens, Jeroboam starts to do something a little bit weird. So Jeroboam, once the kingdom has been split, you have north and south, Jeroboam decides he needs to establish the northern kingdom, Israel, because he has a problem. The problem is that a lot of people in his own kingdom are making pilgrimages to the southern kingdom, where the temple is, to worship Yahweh. And so Jeroboam decides, I need to have a temple here. In fact, I'm not going to have one, but I'm just going to have two temples. So he builds two temples in two areas, one in Dan and also in the other one in Bethel. And what he does is he erects golden calf images in these temples. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because that comes from Exodus. This literally is an echo, and he even quotes Exodus by saying, "These are your gods, the ones that brought you out of Egypt." We hear that from Aaron in Exodus, but we also hear it from Jeroboam as he's telling the people of his northern kingdom in Israel, hey, you have to travel a long way to get to that temple in Jerusalem. Let me make this easy for you. This is where you can worship your God, where you can worship your God Yahweh. This is the God that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, Jeroboam also had some background in Egypt, and so what he's used to is two things. He's used to seeing actual imagery of deities that you worship, but we also start to see, whether he meant to or not, this syncretism. Again, there's that word of a combining of worship of Yahweh and worship of other false deities. Now, another interesting thing to note, in that red bar there, you see those little gray X's. Those in the chart basically denote how the author of 1 Kings identified a good king versus a bad king. The author takes the time to do this and uses the criteria of, did they remain faithful to the worship of Yahweh and Yahweh alone? There's also other criteria of corruption, and basically, I'll sum it up for you, every king of the northern kingdom is remembered as a bad king. There was a handful in the southern kingdom that returned the people of Judah back to the worship of Yahweh and Yahweh alone, but ultimately, even those were the exceptions. Eventually, both kingdoms fall. There's different dates for each one. Guess which one probably fell first? Northern kingdom. We see the establishment of Samaria. There's a long history I could go into, and I almost just did. We don't have a whole lot of time for that. But the history behind what's happening here is incredibly rich. And as you can see, complex too. Now, one more thing I want to point out, because this is where we find ourselves in the story. We're a few kings in to this divided monarchy. There's a yellow square there, just almost to the right, and an arrow pointing to it. That's the ministry of Elijah. It's spanning from 860 to 852 BC. And it's right there just underneath the rule of King Ahab. Now, we're going to talk about King Ahab because King Ahab is basically the main sort of opponent of Elijah that we see in the story. So Elijah, when he's coming in, he's coming right up against King Ahab, who, as we can see from his being a king in the northern kingdom, not a good king. The reason why is because King Ahab married a Canaanite woman named Jezebel. That's a name you've probably heard a lot also in pop culture too. Not used in very positive ways. Because Jezebel, for one, was someone who brought with her her Canaanite worship. She's from the region of Phoenicia, and she comes with the worship of a deity known as Baal. Baal, there's lots of different pronunciations. But she brings with her this worship, and Ahab fully embraces it. There's a little bit of a mixture of the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Baal, but there's this definite leaning, like the needle definitely leans more towards worship of this pagan deity known as Baal. This is very prominent in the northern kingdom as a result. So, out of all this, as all this is going on, in steps Elijah. Now, looks like it got a little bit too crowded for the box that I made for it. But to bring that Hebrew back that I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about who Elijah was. And honestly, there's not a lot to tell as he's coming into the story. But this is his name in Hebrew. There's ways that we can break it down to understand what it means. So, it reads from this direction to this. That's right to left for anyone who's confused. I have to switch it for you guys. It reads from right to left instead of left to right. So the first two letters going this way reads L, and that means God. And there's a little vowel. Now those little dots, those are all vowels. So the little dot underneath that second letter and the little kind of comma-looking mark that's over the third letter, That's denoting an I, which is it's basically a first person, like a possessive. So my. So Eli, we don't know anyone here by that name, do we? That means my God. And the last three letters are part of the name Yahweh. Elijah, which is my God is Yahweh. So imagine this. You have this complicated history of what's going on where the nation of Israel is very hot and cold, and lately very cold. We have a lot of worship of pagan deities, particularly in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is just in bad shape. And Elijah walks right into this. And it's not a good and comfortable place that he can walk into. It's not like a very welcoming, like, oh yeah, you want to talk about the worship of just Yahweh? Sure, fine. Come, like, let us know. Like, let your voice be heard. It's not going to be met with really warm and fuzzy feelings. Because Elijah's name literally means, my God is Yahweh. So, his mission was to oppose Ahab and Jezebel in their idolatrous worship and to turn the people of Israel back to Yahweh. Let's go ahead and look at our passage. Like I said, we're not going to spend a lot of time in it, but go ahead and turn with me, if you will, to the book of 1 Kings chapter 17. If you have your Bible with you, 1 Kings chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. And we're going to read a little bit of this together, but basically, like I mentioned at the beginning, there's three main movements to this story in the chapter of 17. And we're going to look at them each one by one. And what's going to be interesting is just getting to see, like early on in Elijah's journey, as he's getting ready to come on to full confrontation of other prophets who don't serve Yahweh. I'm going to be reading from the NIV, so if you have a different translation, bear with me. But let's read together beginning in verse 1. We're going to read the first 6 verses. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now, I just want to pause for just a moment before we keep reading. This is really significant because Baal was a deity of storms and, yes, rain. So worship of Baal meant this is who I'm relying on to basically nourish my crops. Whether my family gets to eat or not for the next year depends on whether or not I get rain. And this is who I'm putting my trust in. And so in steps Elijah and is saying, there's not going to be any rain. And the only way it's going to come back is at my word. I, the one who serves Yahweh. Let's read on, beginning in verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So, as a general principle from this first movement that I want to sort of bring our attention to, is that what we see is that the living God is more powerful than our idols. The living God is more powerful than our idols. Because what Elijah is doing, I mean, this is a huge, gutsy move from the get-go, is that he's coming and he's sending word to Ahab. I don't know if it was to his face in his court or if this was a message that was sent. But basically, here's how I'm going to prove that what you're doing is not only wrong, but it's foolishness. And there's going to be suffering because of it. This was a heavy pronouncement. But what we see is that God is demonstrating that he is the living God, whereas Baal is not. And in the meantime, God is the one who also provides for Elijah. So as God is sending him out to go deliver this word, he's also sending him to the Kerith ravine, and he literally provides him nourishment in this time because no food or water means no food or water for him as well. There's a huge famine. And so as he's going and as he is living out, my God is Yahweh, he's trusting in him. Yahweh is the one who is taking care of him and is nourishing him. Let's look at our second movement, beginning in verse 7. Look with me, if you will, at verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up, the brook that he was using to drink from, because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. Now pause for just a moment. Because for those of you who don't know, this particular area, this is not in friendly territory. This is actually the home region of Queen Jezebel. This is Canaanite region. This is not an Israelite widow. This is enemy territory that God is telling Elijah to go into to find refuge. Let's continue on. Verse 10, so he went to Zarephath. He came to the town gate. A widow was there gathering sticks. He called her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may have a drink? It's probably been a while since he's had water. As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. So she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. In the second movement, we see that the living God is our true source of provision. The living God is our source of true provision. Now, we mentioned that Elijah is here in enemy territory, and he's going to this widow, and he is asking for a little bit of water, and he's saying, please, if you have some bread, I would love to eat some food. It's probably been a while since a raven has brought him meat and bread to eat. And she lets him know, and this would not have been a shock to Elijah either. Because in this time and in this society, this widow would have been relying on charitable provisions, anything that she can possibly get, which was not going to be much. And in the days of famine, she was going to be the first to run out of food. And this is exactly the situation that Elijah finds her in, is that she's like, this is it. This is the end for me and my son. I'm literally going to go make our last meal, and we have nothing else. There's nothing else coming our way. And it's interesting because we see the last statement that she makes is that we're going to go and we're going to die. Because this is just how it is. Our God is not feeding us. Baal is not coming through for us. So that means we die. And there's going to be this interesting way in which we see a dichotomy between this kind of this versus this here. We see these two themes of life and death. And how Yahweh, God, keeps proving over and over that he is alive, he's there, and he's the one who sustains life. Yahweh provides all the food that they need as long as they need it. One commentator that I got to read from made a really good statement. He said, God's people have what they need, and let me reread this. God's people have what they need and what Baal could not provide. Basically, in this moment, as there's this widespread famine, God's the one proving, I can do this. Let's look at our third movement. We're going to go ahead and read on with verse 16. So go ahead and look back with me. Actually, beginning in verse 17. Because unfortunately, this would be great if that's where the story ended. We're going to see it take a dark turn. Beginning in verse 17, sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh from your mouth is the truth." God is the one who raises the dead son. We see in this third movement that the living God is the true source of our life. The living God is the true source of our life. This is such an important theme because even though Elijah's not the only one that we see in the middle of a miracle of resurrection, right? We see that later from Elisha, who's to follow Elijah. But this should also remind us of the gospel. This should remind us of the fact that we serve a living God who is alive and at work, and who is the one that gives us life. This is a powerful testimony to this widow, because she recognizes that this man is a prophet. She's been spending, obviously, he's staying with them, so he's got a reputation, and so she knows that he's a worshiper of Yahweh. She names it, she recognizes it. And so all she's seeing is calamity, and she's linking it to that this is just my lot in life. This is the God that I worship, and meanwhile I have this man who serves Yahweh here in my house. She's seeing miraculous provision, but she comes to despair when her son dies. And the death that she was anticipating and that she was bracing herself for has already come. And she's not with her son. And the point to keep in mind is that we kind of sometimes we look at how did Elijah do that? And how did he perform this miracle? What's the technical, how can we replicate this kind of cool thing? It's not about what Elijah did. It's not about Elisha and what he did. It's not about what Paul later did. It's what God is doing through them. They're pointing towards the living God and his being the sustainer of life. I read one theologian as we're kind of thinking about what does this mean for us. So I asked some questions in the beginning of, do you ever feel like you are struggling with the reality of God's provision, the reality of God's presence? I know the reason that I bring this up is because these are things that I have struggled with. It can be really easy to, in word, say, like, I know God's going to work things out. And maybe to have seen it a few times where God pulls through at the last second. It's interesting. There were moments, and I'm sure a lot of you have stories like this, but just a couple, like, almost funny things that happened. Like a year ago, it was actually at one of our movie nights last summer. Christine and I, we were struggling to pay some bills. Well, was working a couple different jobs, working here, working at the museum. We were kind of trying to make ends meet. The work wasn't always like a super predictable thing for Christine. But one of the things that happened that I remember was that I got a piece of mail from the IRS. I was like, oh, this can't be good. And I open it up, and there's a check. And I was like, where? How? And it wasn't that it was the exact amount that we needed, but it was very much needed relief at the time. It wasn't worth a lot, but it very much was what we needed. And I realized either that evening or the next day that it was from a tax return that I had filed a while back and I never saw again. I didn't know what had happened to it. I didn't know if it got lost in the mail. I tried to track it, tried to figure out what happened. Nothing. I mean, this was I can't remember how many years I had been between my receiving the check and actually filing the return. But out of the blue, in a summer where we're trying to kind of make ends meet, summers have been usually kind of typically difficult in terms of figuring out finances because things are more expensive. And so it was a rough summer for us, and just all of a sudden having this check, this provision was just wow, what a cool way that I get to see, I was like, this is a God thing. And it's been really neat to see all these little moments where things kind of happen just in the right timing. I mean, even just the way in this last year that we've gotten to see how things that would just, for no other explainable reason, have come together in the way that it needs to, in the moment that we really needed it. And yet, I still sometimes find myself struggling when things really come down to it and really get hard. Is God even real? Does he really even care about what's happening in my life? And oftentimes where I land is yeah, God's real. I still believe that. I think I'm too small for him to care, though. And oftentimes that temptation to kind of take matters into our own hands kind of manifests itself more and more. I mentioned there's this one theologian that I got to read, a guy named Michael Horton, explain a little bit about what idolatry is. Because we talk about that a lot, what is idolatry, and we connect it with, it's the things that you spend a lot of time with more than reading the Bible. That's a thing that you're putting on a pedestal that you're basically worshiping because you're spending more time with that thing than you are in the Bible or in prayer. Is basically kind of at least what I internalized over the years, and the thing, the message that I kind of received. And it was very guilt and shame, kind of well, I just need to do more. And when I wasn't, it was I guess I'm worshiping an idol. What he explains is that idolatry is about control. The things that we create idols out of are a reflection of us in a way. And the things that we put on a pedestal is something that we create, and it's a thing that it's a way that it's, the best way I can describe it, it's a visual control. Let me use an example of idols, even like carven images in the Old Testament, because you think like, well, they're praying to this deity, right? They're trusting in this deity, like, well, I mean, how is that about control? But the truth is, it's a lot easier to feel like you've got some control over your circumstances or over the deity that you worship if you can create that deity, if you can carve that image, if you can look at it. It's a lot harder to live by faith. It's a lot harder when things feel way out of your control. There's not anything you can do about it. What do our idols look like? I can confess to some of the idols that I struggle with. Oftentimes, what I struggle with is when I feel like I'm losing control in my life, I'll try to have noise going on. I was telling the staff one of the things that I tend to struggle with is instead of living and breathing in the truth of Scripture in a, not like a gotta do, but in a, this is a safe place that I can retreat to because this is literally a way that I can spend time with the true and living God. Instead, I've got to have noise. I've got to have a podcast. I've got to have music. I've got to have an audiobook. I've got to distract myself. That's a thing that I can control. I got to have Netflix on. I got to have something that I'm streaming so I can have some noise so I can keep distracting myself because that's a thing that I'm I have some control over, this part of my life. God can have these other things, but this thing I got to have because this is the only place in my life where I feel like I have some control right now. That's my idol. We talk about kind of the paradigm of the head, heart, body. There's lots of different ways that these idols can manifest at times. So I want to challenge you. What are some areas that you feel like you've lost control of? And how are you coping with it? So one of the things I struggle with is how I cope with where I feel like I've lost control. And it prevents me from taking the steps that I need to actually find healing. If I'm struggling with, I really don't want to feel I don't want to feel grief right now. I don't want to feel sorrow. Positive feelings, positive. One of the things I've had to apologize to Christine for a lot is when we're going through it and it's we need to pause and this is just really hard right now. Can we just acknowledge this is hard? I'm no, things are going to be great. Things are going to be okay. God's got us. It's going to be good. And she's okay, you said that a lot, yes. But can you just acknowledge that what happened to me at work today was really hard? But I don't want to, because I'm no, work has to work out. It's got to be great. I'm not dealing with what I need to be dealing with that's going on in my head and in my heart. I'm trying to press on when really I'm not acknowledging a stirring that needs to happen, or I need to pause, and I need to submit, and God, this is really hard right now. There's a lot of different ways that we can, and it is true, the things that we give our time and attention to, our time and talents and treasures, as Pastor Josh likes to say. Because those are the things that we feel like we can control. Now, as I close this morning, I was telling Vincent and Pat as they were practicing and warming up for worship this morning, I was working on the slides for the lyrics for presentation for this morning, and I knew what the songs were going to be, and I got to read through them because Christ Be Magnified, I've heard the song. You know how you hear a song, you don't really pay attention to the words a lot of times? Well, I actually had a moment when I was sermon prepping last night, and just to be real honest, I was struggling with what all do I bring together? Because there's so much that we could talk about. What all is it that you want me to say, God? And I realized, even in the sermon prep process, it was towards the end of the process that I realized, God, I really didn't even come to you in prayer to talk about what it is that you want me to talk about. And I got to reading the words of the song that we sang just this morning. And in case you missed it, because I often do, I want to read part of the song, Christ Be Magnified, to you. So let's just take a moment. Just close your eyes. Just close your eyes, bow your head, as I read these words over you. I won't bow to idols. I'll stand strong and worship you. And if it puts me in the fire, I'll rejoice because you're there too. I won't be formed by feelings. I hold fast to what is true. If the cross brings transformation, then I'll be crucified with you. Because death is just the doorway into resurrection life. If I join you in your sufferings, then I'll join you when you rise. And when you return in glory with all the angels and the saints, my heart will still be singing. My song will be the same. God, we come before you just with a posture of humility. Without shame and without guilt, God, because as you tell us in Hebrews, we get to approach the throne with boldness and confidence, not because of us, not because of anything we've done, but because of who you are and what you have done for us. God, when we talk about and hear about idols, whether it's preached from the pulpit, sometimes we read about it, there's a note of shame. And the problem with shame is it just doesn't bring healing. The shame makes us spiral, and we end up just avoiding the problem altogether. Or we just do, because that's just supposed to fix it. And it's not true. God, I confess to you moments when I've struggled, in moments where instead of just truly giving and submitting to you and just laying what's burdening my heart at the foot of the cross, so that your peace, which transcends all understanding, may dwell within my heart, instead I just hold on to it. Instead, I either try to push through or try to just slather it with positivity. And God, in moments where I could be experiencing life and joy in you, I choose to run. God, as we sit here together as a family, we just thank you so much for who you are. That you are the living God. And as you showed us in your word, through a man literally named, my God is Yahweh, may we look at this man's life and what he is pointing us to, just be reminded that you are the true and living God. The biggest testimony to that is the fact that we're all sitting in this room right now. We thank you so much for sending your Son. Jesus, we thank you for not just coming and living an earthly life and experiencing pain the way that we do, but also taking punishment that we deserved. so that by putting our faith in you, we may experience newness of life and one without shame. You took it away. As we go forward, we just thank you so much for, again, the opportunity that we have to get to know people. And as we go out from today, I just ask that if there's any messages of shame that are spinning around, God, that you would just give peace. Pray for my brothers and sisters in this room, those who are watching online. You'd help us as we're seeking after you and as we're growing in relationship with one another and as we're cultivating growth as a church community. And when we are struggling with shame and we are struggling with avoidance or maybe trying to control something, that we can come and bring it to one another in safety and knowing that we're here for each other. We can pray for one another, encourage, that we don't have to walk out of this room today with shame. But that you want us, our whole selves, mind, heart, body, so that people can see the peace that we have and the lives that we're living and wonder what's different. I thank you that I've already been getting to see that at this church. This is not a condemning sermon at all. This is an encouragement and gratitude. Thank you for the work that you're doing. We love you and pray these things in the precious name of your Son, Jesus, by the power of your Spirit. Amen.